Hey, good morning, everybody. Thank you all for attending today. We appreciate your time. We're going to talk a little bit today about ransomware threats to the election and hopefully not scare too many people. So a little bit about me. I'm an intelligence analyst at Recorded Future. I have more than 15 years experience as both a bleed teamer and a red teamer. And basically how I spend my day is helping organizations integrate threat intelligence into their workflow. So we know that there are a number of threats to the 2020 election, which is now just a few days away, although technically it's been ongoing for a couple of months as early voting has really picked up a lot. One of those threats is the possibility of a ransomware attack against election infrastructure. And we're going to look at three different threats today: voter registration databases, poll books, and voter results websites. But we're also going to talk a little bit about misinformation and disinformation, because that plays a big part in some of the threats that we're talking about. So we know that ransomware threats against elections has been a hot topic of conversation. There's been all kinds of news coverage of it, and there's been all kinds of concern around whether or not a ransomware attack could happen against US elections. But in the security world, we have to learn to distinguish between, okay, yes, that's a potential threat, and oh crap, this is something we need to worry about. So the question I had to ask as I sat down with this is this an oh crap problem, or is this a, yeah, okay, in theory it could happen, but who knows? So again, just because a topic gets a lot of coverage doesn't mean it's an actual threat. I kind of go back to last year. There was a whole bunch of news stories about how an attacker could launch a ransomware attack against against Canon EOS cameras. There was a vulnerability that you could exploit, and you could encrypt the camera itself. Whole lot of news stories about them. But the question is there a high likelihood of attack, and can the attackers make money? Because when we talk about ransomware, just because something can be done doesn't mean it'll actually be done unless there's some profit at the end, because that's what cyber criminals want. Unfortunately, in the case of election, we know that there is a high likelihood of successful attack, and there is potentially a lot of money to be made by pulling off a successful attack. So going back to the first question, we know election systems were targeted in all 50 states, according to the Senate Intelligence Report, and in 16 of those states, the attackers managed to be in the same network as a voter registration database. But in this case, we were talking about nation-state actors, specifically Russian nation-state actors. And so that's one level of skill, but what about cyber criminals? Do cyber criminals have that same level of skill? And so, yes, unfortunately, yes, they do. We saw this in 2016 when the Palm Beach County in Florida elections office was hit with a ransomware attack. Now, no election infrastructure, but workstations were. And we also know that ransomware groups specifically target state and local governments. So over the last couple of years, Recorded Future has tracked more than 200 publicly reported ransomware attacks against state and local governments. That number is a fraction of the actual attacks, because not all ransomware attacks become publicly reported. But over 200 attacks means that ransomware actors are going after state and local governments, which means that they have a lot of experience in that area. They know the weaknesses of state and local governments. They know how to exploit them. And we also know that state and local governments' security offices are perpetually underfunded. Really, really good people working there. They just don't have a lot of resources to fight back. And now with this election, what we've seen is we've already seen two attacks. Hall County election systems were impacted by a ransomware attack, which slowed down some of their ability to count some absentee ballots. They still had the manual process that they switched back to. And then same thing in Chenango County in New York. There were some ballot requests that were affected. So people requesting absentee ballots those weren't able to get through because of the ransomware attack, so people had to re-request them. Nothing that's going to disrupt the election, but it may slow things down, and that obviously is a concern. So again, go back to, there were 111 reported ransomware attacks on state and local governments in 2019, and even with the slowdown because of coronavirus, we're already past 100 in 2020. Ransomware actors have gotten more sophisticated, and especially with what we call big game hunting. So the way big game hunting works is, and we're seeing this with the hospital attacks that are currently happening. You have a multi-stage attack where you have either, whether it's through phishing or exploiting remote desktop protocol or Citrix or another weakness, they get in, they deploy a loader, and then they spend time learning the network, understanding the network, gaining the accesses they need, and then deploying the ransomware, which means that they really understand how the networks work, and the timing of their attacks has never been better. And the perfect example of that is with attacks on schools. So this year we recorded 20, again, publicly reported attacks on school systems around the country. And these attacks are designed specifically to disrupt the start of the school year. So what happens is the ransomware actors hit a couple days or the day school's supposed to start. And what you see is schools either scrambling to pay their ransom so that they don't have to delay the start of school, or school actually having to start late. So starting a couple days later, the school year starting a couple days later, because there is because they can't have students, whether it's online or in person, they can't have students in place because of the ransomware attack. And this, again, this shows a deeper understanding of how these networks work and how these systems work by the ransomware actors. And that's when you do this, when you do hundreds of attacks like this, and even individual ransomware actors have now done dozens of these attacks, you really get to understand the systems you're going after. On top of that, we have to talk about extortion. So, a ransomware attack, again, especially when we're talking about big game hunting, a ransomware attack is not like it was in 2016. So if you think of a ransomware attack in 2016, it's kind of like knocking over a liquor store, right? It's smash and grab. You go in, you get what you want, you get out. This is much more complex. Think Ocean's 11, but with way uglier people than George Clooney and Brad Pitt. If you've ever seen pictures of these mugshots, these are not pretty human beings that are carrying out these attacks. On top of everything else, the election officials now have to worry about ransomware and extortion, because if an attacker is successful, but the county or the state doesn't pay the ransom, you still have the problem of ransomware actors potentially stealing millions and millions of voter records, and not the publicly available voter records that anybody can get a hold of, but things like the signature database and all of the other critical private stuff that the states or the counties don't release. So it's possible to still save the election, but have this nightmare scenario where your whole voter database is exposed to the internet. Obviously bad. So we know the attackers are good. We know they've gotten a lot more skilled in the last 4 years. And we know that they are targeting state and local governments. Well, what about the other side? What about defense? There isn't really a consistent election security policy. Essentially, there are 56 election security policies, the 50 states, the District of Columbia, and the territories. But it's even more complex than that, because not every state maintains a top-down voter registration database, which is the state maintains the central voter registration database, while the counties and the localities feed off of that. Some states maintain what's called a bottom-up, where either the counties or the cities will maintain, or localities will maintain, the voter registration database and feed that into the state, or a hybrid where some counties are top down, some are bottom up, which means that really there's a whole bunch of different security policies out there, each funded independently, each with its own view of what's important and what isn't. So on the one hand, that makes it really difficult to coordinate a ransomware attack because you don't know what you're coming up against. But it doesn't need to be coordinated to be disruptive. You have dozens of threat actors that are essentially targeting election infrastructure because they think there's a big payday there. And election officials are often reluctant, understandably, to share information, which makes it really hard to externally assess the nature of the ransomware threat. We are starting to see some change. So both Ohio and Iowa launched bug bounty programs on election infrastructure this year, which I think is a good first step. You want to get the security community involved, and you want them to look for things that maybe your team hadn't noticed or hadn't been picked up by other traditional scans. So I think this is a good way for the security community to get more involved in helping states secure their election infrastructure. And I hope more states do that. But you can provide some insight into the threat by looking at open source information. And I also do want to say that a lot of the vendors that supply voting infrastructure are also reluctant to discuss security flaws. In fact, we've seen some that have gone so far as to sue security researchers who report potential security flaws. Now, again, we've seen some of this starting to change with some voting vendors working more closely, not closely, need to emphasize that, but more closely than before with security vendors. Coming down from not suing isn't necessarily mean that you're working closely, but it does mean that there's at least an openness there. And I think that's good. Certainly it's too little too late for this election, but going forward, we have future elections that we need to secure and worry about. So what does election infrastructure look like? Most of it looks like the rest of the state's network infrastructure. It appears that most states, even when purchasing a specialty voting product, rely heavily on commercial off-the-shelf solutions. This means, for example, that most voter registration databases sit on Oracle or Microsoft SQL, excuse me. But as with any specialty system, states are often heavily dependent on third-party vendors to update their systems. So there's a lot of interconnected parts there, and you want to make sure that if you are patching one part of the system, you may break other parts. So often they have to rely on their third-party vendors to do the patching. So that does lead to some concerning bits of information being reported, such as thousands of election terminals still running Windows 7, requirements that administrators use Internet Explorer to access voter registration databases, and a heavily reliance across multiple states on Citrix and remote desktop protocol to manage infrastructure. We know that Citrix is a common attack point, as is remote desktop protocol, common attack point for ransomware operators. And unfortunately, having so many systems using both Citrix and remote desktop protocol, it does make election infrastructure more vulnerable. And the thing is, because these systems are vulnerable, even if the election infrastructure is not connected to the internet, attackers can still gain access to it. So that Citrix server may not be connected to the internet, but if it's connected to the rest of the county network, even a segmented network, that does make it accessible or vulnerable to a potential attack by attackers, ransomware actors, especially if it's not properly patched and secured. So the biggest thing we worry about is attacks that affect the voter registration database, which is what we saw in both Hall County and Chenango County. An attacker that encrypts a voter registration database on or near an important date, such as National Voter Registration Day or the first day of voting, which so far so good, that hasn't happened. A day or two prior to poll books being pushed out. One that disrupts the ability of a state to disseminate, a state or county to disseminate mail-in ballots, or the day after the election. So a lot of states don't start counting mail-in ballots until the day after the election. And so that voter registration database is going to be really important to be able to view that. Oddly, the one day that a ransomware attack won't have a whole lot of impact is if it happens on election day itself, because by then everything's been pushed out and the database is just kind of sitting idle that day for most states. That doesn't apply to everything, but for most states, that's the case. Another scenario we worry about is attacks on poll books. So poll books are used by election workers to check in on election day. 41 states and Washington, D.C. have switched to electronic poll books. We do know that they get updates pushed to them from central servers, and we know that ransomware actors have used Trojanized updates to push out ransomware. So that's one potential attack vector. The other is they could just encrypt everything on that update server so that none of the poll books could get their updates. The good news is that in most cases, the counties or the states can go back to using paper verification systems. So for those of you who are old like me, you'll remember you go into your polling place and they have this big old dot matrix printout of all the voters in that precinct, and so we can fall back to that, and that those kind of things are in place to protect that. The problem is it slows down the election incredibly. It makes it's a lot longer to go through that process. The final thing that we have to worry about is attacks on voter results database. So each state maintains its own voter results database or page, or they outsource it to a third party. So we know ransomware groups such as NetWalker do target vulnerable websites. And the websites, yes, that's important because that's what the public looks at, but you also want to make sure that you're protecting the actual database that all the updates get pushed out to, because that really would be the major target. If the database goes, if the website goes down, that's bad, but you can still get results out. But if that actual database goes down, then the precincts don't have anything to upload the results to. So the results aren't impacted, but the ability to report the results are, and that could lead to that could lead to a lot of disruption. So good news. I used to say, hey, the good news is it hasn't happened yet. Unfortunately, we've already seen 2 of them. So I guess the good news is that what we haven't seen is we haven't seen anything that's actually going to disrupt the ability of people to vote, which is great. There are backups upon backups upon backup systems. But we do know that they've already happened. We do know there's a chance that the threat actors are, if they're going to do anything, they are probably already in the networks, which is not great. We know that there's a lot of threat hunting going on right now, looking for these bad guys. But you have all of that, plus you have unprecedented early voting happening and everything else. So election officials are stretched very thin right now. So it's possible for things to slip through the cracks. Unfortunately, several bills providing states with much needed election security funding have been held up in the Senate since February. That's a problem. Obviously, at this point, it's too late anyway. But then we add to that contractions in the economy because of COVID-19 have resulted in states having to furlough employees, including IT and security staff. States have acknowledged that some of their security measures aren't adequate and continue asking for additional funding for election security. We were worried that a lot of state elections security training didn't even mention ransomware. Again, at this point, that's probably a little too late. But it is worth noting that that not all the states are up to date on the latest training capabilities. So there is some outside help that's been coming in, though. CISA conducted multiple tabletop the vote exercises. They went through a number of scenarios, including ransomware, with a bunch of states. 10-minute warning. CISA also offers a number of freely available services to states to help improve their election infrastructure. The Center for Internet Security also maintains the election infrastructure iSIGHT. The iSIGHT is free to join for state, territorial, tribal governments, and provides a number of benefits, including vulnerability assessment, threat notifications, malicious code analysis, etc. There are almost 2,700 members of the iSIGHT, but that number is less than half the counties in the country. So we need more people to be part of that because that information sharing is really important. There are 2 really cool programs that have been out. So CISA has authorized a EDR pilot program, and they have across the country 10,000 workstations that have in election infrastructure that have participated in the EDR pilot program, which I think is pretty great. They're getting a lot of state and local government specific indicators being fed to them from CIS, and that's detected a number of attacks. Similarly, Albert is a cost-based security monitoring solution, kind of like an IDS, that's only available to state, local, territorial, and tribal governments. It uses a combination of open source and private indicators to build a signature database that looks for threats specific to state and local governments. So several state and local governments are using Albert to monitor their election infrastructure, and that monitoring has actually caught a number of attacks and been able to alert CIS, which has helped step in and stop the attacks before they could do bad. So we are seeing a change in how state and local governments and national governments are working together. And that's been a big help in improving the security here. In early October, Cyber Command and several security companies led by Microsoft launched efforts to disrupt the TrickBot botnet. So we know that they've already rebuilt a bunch of that botnet. However, what we did see is that a number of the victims that were infected prior to the disruption were no longer able to communicate with the command and control infrastructure, and that's really good. So what we think happened is there are a number of state and local governments that have been infected with TrickBot, and TrickBot generally leads to the RIA ransomware being installed. Again, that's what we're seeing with the healthcare providers over the last few days. And what we think happened is this activity disrupted the ability of existing victims to communicate with command and control infrastructure, which means that the attackers lost that access. And that's, again, really important because it keeps them safe. This is really, really important. And the last thing that I'm going to talk about, the biggest concern about election officials is not a ransomware attack, but it's disinformation that could result from a ransomware attack. So a breakdown in the perception of the validity of the election results, a successful attack or unsuccessful, whether it's ransomware or otherwise, could undermine confidence in the election. And that's really concerning. So, and that's where we get headlines like this: voter details for millions of Americans found on Russian hacking site. Yes, that happened, but these headlines came out before anybody actually checked with the Michigan Secretary of State to say, hey, did somebody hack your database? And the answer was no. Somebody just bought the records that are publicly available to anybody and then tried to resell them on underground forums. That's, I mean, not great, but that's not the same thing as what's, again, the sensitive details that are in a voter registration database. Same thing where, again, we saw the Hall County election systems that were infected by ransomware. So the voting process hadn't been disrupted, but somehow that in some of these headlines turned into ransomware knocks out voter database in Georgia. That's not what happened. And so we've got to be really careful about misinformation and disinformation. Rely heavily on your state secretary of state or your head election official. They're doing everything they can right now to combat a whole bunch of misinformation and bad information that's out there. And the concern is that even an unsuccessful ransomware attack can be used to spread disinformation about election security. So one group tries to conduct a ransomware attack, it fails. You will have you will have enemy governments that will try and start misinformation or disinformation campaigns to take that little nugget of truth and turn that into, you can't trust the results of the election. So you've got to be really careful in where you're getting the information from, and listen to anything that comes out in the news over the next couple of days with a careful scrutiny, because, you know, again, there's going to be a lot of misinformation and disinformation out there. I really thank you all for your time. I know